Hi, everybody. So in this video, we are going to go over how to convert between fractions, decimals, and percents, because we can write equivalent forms of all three of these types of numbers. So if you want to take a moment in your notebook to separate out this page into 6 sections, so you can draw yourself 1 column and then 3 rows. So there's six small sections. And go ahead and pause the video and take a moment to label them appropriately. So we're going to be converting, decimals to fraction in this first section, percent to fraction in the second section. So go ahead, pause the video and label your 6 sections, and then go ahead and hit play when you are ready to start seeing how we convert. Okay, so now that you have your sections labeled, I have kind of separated this out into what I would classify as like, this row is going to be our easy row. The second row is going to be our medium difficulty level row. And then the last 2 sections I think are the hardest out of converting between fractions, decimals, and percents. And because of that, these 2 sections, if you want to put a little star next to them, these 2 sections are the kinds of questions that are typically asked of you on assessments like STAR, on our short cycle assessments that we take, on the algebra screener. I believe there's a couple questions. So these 2 sections are going to be of utmost importance when you pay attention. I'm actually going to kind of go through the top 4 sections pretty quickly. Pause for a second if you need to like regroup, and then kind of focus mainly on the bottom section. So the first section, I kind of separated it into these 4 different categories, going from decimals to fractions, percents to fractions. So when we're converting a decimal or a percent to a fraction, it's actually pretty simple. And then when we convert between percents and decimals, it's also pretty simple. So I'm going to do this by picking a couple of number examples. So let's focus in this first section. I'm going to zoom in more so it's easier to see. Let's first focus on decimals to fractions. So we're going to look at the examples 0.03, 0.64, and then I'm going to pick 1.52. So when we convert decimals to fractions, essentially all we need to do is look at the place value that our decimal ends in. So for example, all of these decimals, they end in the hundreds place value. So if I was to say this decimal with its place value, for example, this is 3 hundredths. This one, 64 hundredths. This is 1 and 52 hundredths. That decimal place value of hundredths is kind of the key to the fraction I create. That place value of hundredths is the denominator. So 3 hundredths is just written like this, 3 hundredths. That's how we would say that fraction. 64 hundredths, 64 hundredths. This is 1.52, so this is 1 and 52 hundredths. Essentially, we are making a mixed number, okay? And once I have the fractions set up, the last thing I'm gonna check, just like with all fractions, is I'm gonna see if I can simplify any of these fractions. So 3 hundredths is already in its most simplified form. 64 hundredths, that can be simplified. We can divide both of these by 4, and it simplifies to 16 over 25. And then 1 and 52 hundredths, again, we can divide 52 hundredths both by 4. So this simplifies to 1 and 13 25ths. So if you need to put a decimal into a fraction, all you need to do is look at the place value that it ends in, write it with that denominator. So if for some reason I had 0.3, that 3, not 0.03, not what I have, but if I had this, I'll write it over here. If I had this, that ends in the tenths place. So my denominator would be 10, 3 tenths. And then I would see if I could simplify that fraction. If I had 0.6, that'd be 6 tenths. And I would see if I could simplify that fraction. So you look at the place value, use that place value as your denominator, keep the decimal, whatever it is, as your numerator, and then see if you can simplify, okay? When we make a percent into a fraction, so let's say we're given 26%, and I'll use 49%. Okay, this word percent, if we kind of broke it down and looked up what's the meaning of the word per and what's the meaning of the word cent, it translates to for each 100. So if I have 26% of something, that means I have 26, whatever I'm talking about, 26 points. If I'm talking about a grade, 26 points for each 100 points on an assignment, or 49 points for each 100 points on an assignment. So when we put them as a fraction, again, we can use this idea of what percent actually means. This is saying 26 for each 100. So 26 over 100, 49%, 49 over 100. And once we have the fraction set up, we just then need to look if we can simplify it. So 49 hundredths does not simplify, but 26 hundredths, you could divide both these by 2 and you would get 13 over 50. So using this root word of understanding percent means for each 100, anytime you need to put a percent into a fraction, you rewrite it as 26 over 100, 49 over 100. If I had 55%, 55 over 100. If I had a decimal, like if I had 1.3%, that would be 1.3 over 100, which yes, that means you have a decimal within your fraction, but it's okay. And then you just see if you can simplify the fraction at any point. The medium section, converting between percents and decimals, is pretty simple. All we're going to be doing, depending on which number we start out with, which kind of number we start out with, we're either going to be multiplying by 100 or we're going to be dividing by 100. So when we put a percent into a decimal, all we are essentially are doing is we are dividing by 100. We're going to look at our percent, we're going to divide it by 100. When we're putting a decimal into a percentage, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to multiply by 100. So I'm going to use the little asterisk to mean multiplication. Okay. And there's actually a trick with decimals. We can move our decimals a certain number of spots, and that's a visual trick to represent dividing or multiplying by 100. So let's look at some examples. If I'm going to convert percents to decimals, let's say I have 6%, 15%, and I'm going to put a percentage that has a decimal already in it. So 33.3%. So to convert these to decimals, I need to divide each of these numbers by 100. So 6 divided by 100, 15 divided by 100, 33.3 divided by 100. I could set up long division, but why do that? The visual trick is to take the percentage. So 6, 15, 33.3. And move our decimal place. Move our decimal place 2 places backwards, 2 places to the right, because every time we move a decimal place forward or backward, we're moving it by a base of 10. So when we move backwards, we're dividing by 10 each time we move our decimal place. When we move forward by 1 spot, we're multiplying by 10. So because it's 100, we need to move our decimal back 2 places. So it's like 10 times 10. So with percentages like 6 and 15%, our decimal point is technically like right here, right? 6.0, 15.0, that's the same thing as 15. That's the same thing as 6. So if I move my decimal place back 2 spots in all of these, okay, that new spot is where the decimal needs to go. So 6% as a decimal. Oh, I'm sorry, I put it in the wrong spot here. It needs to go. Sorry. 6% as a decimal is equivalent to 0.06. 15% as a decimal is equivalent to 0.15. 33.3% as a decimal is equivalent to 0.333. So all I did was move that decimal place 2 places back to represent I am dividing by 100 when I do that trick. Now, for decimal to percent, we're going to do the opposite. So let's say I have 0.65, 1.27, and 0.05. I'm going to look at where my decimals are located. And the trick for moving it to percent is now I'm going to multiply by 100. So instead of going back 2 spots, I'm going to move forward 2 spots. 1, 2, 1, 2. And where that decimal point is now, that is now going to be my percentage. So this translates to 65.0, which is the same thing as 65%. This now translates to 127.0, which is 127%. Yes, you can have a percentage over 100. That does exist. This translates to 5.0, which is 5%. So when we convert between decimals and percents, we either need to move our decimal place 2 places back or 2 places forward. It just depends if we're going from percent to decimal or decimal to percent. For the last section, I'm going to go ahead and take a brief pause right here. So if you want to pause and just make sure you kind of understand these 4 sections, you can come up and ask me any clarifying questions, because the next part of this video is going to be a little bit more in depth about how we convert between fractions and decimals. I'm going to show you multiple ways for those categories. So go ahead if you need to pause, review this real quick. If you think you're ready to go, just I'm about to start it. So pause if you need it. All right, so these last 2 sections, they're not necessarily hard in terms of the calculations that you have to do. There's multiple ways that you can convert fractions to decimals. There's multiple ways that you can convert fractions to percent. I'm going to show you both ways using the same example. So let's say I have the fraction, I'm going to just use the fraction 4 out of 100, okay? If you have the fraction 4 out of 100, okay? Putting it as a decimal is already kind of a given because they tell you what the place value is. It is hundredths. So if I was to write 4 hundredths, I need to make sure the 4 is in the hundredths place. So a fraction that has a base of 10, like 4 hundredths, is very easy to write as a decimal. If I had 4 tenths, that 4 would go right here instead of the 0. However, if they give you a fraction where it's not quite as easy to convert it, let's say they give you, I'm going to use a relatively simple example for the sake of time, but let's say I gave you 3/5, and I'm going to write this down twice. Okay. There's 2 ways that you can convert these fractions to a decimal. The first is look at your denominator. Is your denominator a factor of 100? Meaning, can you multiply the denominator times something to make 100? If you can do that, I'm going to suggest you don't use any sort of long division, okay? Because what I mean by that is 3/5, 5 is a factor of 100, okay? So 3/5 can be written as something over 100. I just need to think about what times 5 makes 100. The answer to that is 20. So if I multiply 5 times 20, and if I keep everything equivalent and do the same thing to my numerator, 3 times 20 is 60, okay? So now I have this fraction 60 over 100. I can put 60 over 100 into a very simple decimal, right? 60 hundredths means that this, it needs to look like this, 0.60. This needs to end in the hundredths spot. But since this is just a 0 after the 6, I can rewrite this as just 0.6. It simplifies to this decimal. Okay, so to put a fraction into a decimal, if you can use the denominator to rewrite a new fraction, an equivalent fraction over 100, I would do that. I did not have to do any long division. I just had to think of some multiplication facts, okay? However, if it's a situation where the denominator is not a factor of 100, you will have to divide, okay? So this is saying 3 divided by 5. Remember, the fraction bar means to divide. So if I divide 3 divided by 5, it is going to look like this. 3 is on the inside, 5 is on the outside. 5 cannot go into 3. However, I can put a decimal point and I can put as many zeros as I want. I typically put 2. I'm just going to put 1 for right now. And now I can treat this like how many times can 5 go into 30? So 5 goes into 30 6 times. My decimal point goes up here. If I subtract, I do not have a remainder. So again, my answer is 0.6. Okay, so either one of these methods can work. However, depending on your denominator, you may not be able to use this equivalent fraction method. You'll have to do the long division. Okay, Sorry, this is kind of what I was saying. It's a little harder because long division tends to be complicated sometimes. So this is how we put fractions into decimals. We either divide the numerator by denominator to get the decimal, or we can set up an equivalent fraction over 100 if our denominator is a factor of 100 and go from there, okay? To convert fraction to percent, again, there's two different ways. I am going to use the fraction 3/25 to show you both methods, okay? The first method, very similar to the equivalent fraction method with decimals. If you can rewrite your fraction as a fraction over 100, okay, if the denominator is a factor of 100, that's going to make figuring out what the percentage is a lot easier, because remember, percent means for each 100. 49 over 100 equals 49%. 26 over 100 equals 26%. So if you can write your fraction as something over 100, whatever your numerator is the percent. So for example, 3 over 25, 25 is a factor of 100. I can have it equal something over 100. I just have to think about how many times can 25 go into 100. That is 4. So if I multiply the denominator by 4, I'm going to multiply the top by 4. 3 times 4 is 12. 12 over 100 equals 12%. So boom, I found the percentage just by finding an equivalent fraction of something over 100. Okay. If your denominator is not a factor of 100, okay, this is a two-step process. The first step is you're going to have to convert this fraction into a decimal. If it's not a factor of 100, that probably means you're going to have to do the long division route. So you're going to have to put this fraction as a decimal, and then you're going to have to convert that decimal to a percent. Decimal to percent's not hard. You just have to move your decimal 2 places forward. That's why we did it up here first. Okay. So if I have to do it this other way, all right, 3 divided by 25 looks like this. 3 divided by 25. 25 cannot go into 3. So I'm going to put 1 or 2 zeros. I'm going to put 2. Okay. And now at this point, I'm treating it like how many times can 25 go into 300? So 25 can go into 30 once. My decimal place stays here. My remainder is going to be 5. So then I'm going to bring down my 0. 25 goes into 50 twice. 25 times 2 is 50. So I don't have a remainder. So that means 0.12 is what 3/25 is as a decimal. 0.12. If we then multiply it by 100 or move that decimal 2 places forward, we are going to get 12.0, which is the same thing as 12%. Okay, so again, if you can rewrite it as a fraction over 100, that'll save you some time. If you cannot, you have to convert the fraction to a decimal and then multiply that decimal times 100 or convert that decimal to a percent. Please take a moment to pause and review and make sure you understand, and then you can go ahead and try your next assignment. Please come to me or your teacher if you have clarifying questions.